the spur of the moment. And so we had to scramble to make sure that everything was in place to be able to receive this group. Just a little bit frustrating, but as has been described by this morning, our women jumped right in and they were all ready, right? All brand new babies that had been born that fall, and our Rebecca was born in December 25th, and we were getting ready to hook up our indoor toilet. Momentous occasion. The very first people to use our shower in that new bathroom, the campaigners. I don't know if you remember that. Do you remember that? Okay. We're live. So we just flushed the toilet and we're live. So on that very first campaign group in '81 came Tom Winkler, who was talking about med school at that point, but hadn't gone to med school yet. And we have enjoyed him not only on that first campaign, but on that second, the next year came back again, and then went to med school very quickly after that and came to see us right after he graduated. And we're just so thankful that we have stayed connected over the years. He was a wonderful supporter of ours, and then also for Richard and Hilda for many years. I don't even know how many, but grateful for the local church that he is a part of, Saturn Road Church, a great church, where we first got to hear the presentation with Dr. Stephen Meyer, and that was, I don't even know what year, but it's been a great connection, and so we're looking forward to hearing what Tom has to bring. And also, bear in mind, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions afterwards, so I look forward to hearing what questions you have for what he's sharing. So, Tom.
Two things about myself. First, let me talk about my family. That was at my stepdaughter Jenna, her wedding. That's her stepdaughter and her husband. It's his daughter from a prior relationship. Those of you that heard me cry this morning, that's my Becca standing next to me. And on the opposite side is my wife Sharon and Thomas Jr. Thomases have at least three things in common. They love sports, they're math nerds, and they cry pretty easy. All right, so just a quick story. When he was a little guy, probably 2 years old, I decided I'm going to take him to a high school football game. Made the mistake of sitting too close to the band. The band starts playing loud. He buries his head in my chest, is scared to death. And so immediately I walk away and move 3 or 4 sections away from where the band is. And gradually he starts to turn around and start to explore the environment, safe in Daddy's arms. And all of a sudden he gets real happy. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. Numbers! And if you know my story with my daughter this morning, those were early signs that he was going in the right direction developmentally, because he wasn't even 2 years old then. And he's a computer engineer and programmer at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City. His paycheck is United States Department of Defense. He's not in the military. He and I have been going around the country the last 5 or 6 years trying to knock off Major League Baseball parks together. We were in Omaha just 3 weeks ago and saw some of the College World Series together. I was in Oklahoma City with him about a week or two before that and watched the University of Texas play Texas Tech for the Women's College World Series in softball. So if there's tiddlywinks going on and somehow either one of the Dallas Pro teams or the University of Texas is involved, we're going to be there, it seems like. But anyway, I do cry easily, so does he. I get emotional, it's just my nature, so bear with me now. I am really thrilled to get to share this with you today because I do believe God has put me in a position outside of medicine, which was my dream career And I was absolutely living in my dream in the late aughts. And a couple things happened. First, let me go back a little bit. When I was in high school, yes, I wore a calculator holster on my belt. And I really loved anything science. Well, there's a problem with that when you're going to a public high school, and one that had a lot of a gifted science program. My peers and my teachers had absolutely no problem with teaching the theory of evolution or believing the theory of evolution. And I was not reconciling it very well with what I was learning at church. And I'm actually brought this up to some youth sponsors and maybe even a youth minister, I could forget, and I was handed some literature. So here, this will help answer your question. It wasn't very good, and I knew it would not hold up in an open, honest discussion with anyone with a deep scientific IQ of some sort, and it was very troubling to me. I went to a summer youth series in Fort Worth before my senior year in high school. All the Tarrant County churches would gather all over the summer at various different churches in the Fort Worth area. And we'd have varying speakers came. And one night I went to hear someone at Burleson High School, it's just south of Fort Worth, and it was a man named John Clayton. Big difference maker. First time I had heard anybody talk about faith in God, I said, this will hold water. This is good stuff. Life-changing. So, I was, I was very happy when I went off to college. I felt like my faith was solid. And I kind of put that argument aside, frankly. And for years, I really wasn't as into apologetics as I had been until in the late aughts, when I'm in the absolute sweet spot of my medical practice, I started feeling a tug. Tom, is this really what you need to be doing the rest of your professional life? I was not sure that there was supposed to be an answer to the question, but I was convinced it had to be asked. So while that very thing was happening, two separate incidences occurred that rocked me pretty hard. There was a young man, two young men that I had already had a prior connection with, that about the same time both told me they had lost their faith in God. That was incredibly troubling to me, and I tried to invest time in both of them. And I wasn't getting much with them. So just remember that, and we'll go on here just a second. So, the bad news. This was a 2022 survey of United States citizens, and it was just a simple question. Do you believe in God, yes or no? There was no bar of belief in God. It was just, do you believe in God? And so there wasn't a quantification, well, prove it, like how often do you go to church? Are you a part of a church body? What's your view of Jesus Christ and the resurrection? None of that. It was just simply, do you believe in God? Not defined. Now, that's in the United States, and that's almost 3 years ago. I can almost bet you that 81% has gone down even lower. I know 10 years earlier when the same survey was done, it was 90%. So it had dropped 10 years since 2012 to 2022. I'm sure it's even worse. In fact, I'm almost certain I had a similar survey done in England at that time. It was 50% in the UK, and probably even worse in Western Europe. That's kind of concerning. And the question is, oh, and also, no surprise, guess which age group it was most prominent in? 18 to 30. The nuns, no longer religiously affiliated. Okay? That's kind of bad news. The question is why? What was happening? No, I think it's multiple factors. I do. I'll tell you, the organization I work for, Discovery Institute, let me briefly tell you about that. It's a long story how I got there, but nonetheless, the part I work for is a program called the Center for Science and Culture, which promotes the theory of intelligent design. We actually do not use the sacred text to argue for God. We want to play on the enemy's playing field, okay? The Bible tells me so is a wonderful thing to the people in this room. It's a conversation stopper if you're dealing with someone who's lost their faith or never had it to begin with. We don't, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but Discovery Institute, there's a story where God was leading me there in that period in the aughts. I had no idea. It wouldn't show up for 7 more years, but he was leading me to where I am today, and he shook me at one point to get me out of medicine. So our survey found 65%, this was in 2016, so halfway between those two statistics I mentioned. 65% of self-described atheists and 43% of agnostics believe the findings of science make the existence of God less probable. That's more so than pain and suffering and evil. So science is a big player. It's not the only one. I'll be the first one to tell you that. But it's a big, big player in people losing their faith. Okay? The new atheist. There's 2 of them pictured here. Daniel Dennett just passed away maybe in the last 3 months. So Dawkins, another one that's passed away is Christopher Hitchens, and then another one that's still alive today. There's 2 of the original 4 big new atheists that were really active in selling tons of books in the aughts. Was Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. So Dawkins is still alive, Dennett just passed away, and Harris is still alive. So, because of Richard Dawkins, those 2 young men, at least one of them, and I think both of them, had been influenced by Dawkins. Now, this is years after I've gone through that high school faith crisis. It's probably, 78 to 08, almost 30 years. And so I haven't really dug into that much. And frankly, I was reading things about Dawkins without reading his book. He'd written several books. The God Delusion was one of his best sellers. And that's one of the young men had read that book. And it just concerned me that what am I going to find out if I read it? I was a little scared. Let's be honest with you. This is one of his famous statements. The universe we observe has precisely the property we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Life of the party, that guy, right? No, that's basically what the implications of this is. Really, the only realities are matter and energy. There is no super intelligence. There is no supernatural. Cannot be a part of the worldview. It's not allowed even in the door. No evil. That's so ironic because he's in the God Delusion. He rails on the God of the New Testament. Of the Old Testament. Rails on him and calls him evil. In one of the debates with one of my heroes, a guy named John Lennox, says, Richard, how can you possibly make a statement like God is evil when you've just declared evil doesn't even exist? We'll get to Richard a little bit more later, but the point was this is classic out of him. And he scared me. So the materialist worldview, this picture is a good illustration of it. You see, that's representing the Michelangelo Sistine Chapel picture of God. Remember the one touching Adam? Well, in this little circle, That's nature, that's time, that's humans, that's the sun, moon, stars. It's everything in this particular worldview, because you can't have that. That circle is self-contained. There's no intervention of a creator, a designer allowed in that argument. Here's the materialist credo. From eternity were the particles, and the particles became complex living stuff, and the living stuff became aware, and the living stuff conceived of God. That's it. That's the worldview that modern science has. In the academy, in the legal system, frankly, it pervades the Western culture. United States, Canada, Europe, all. So the implication of this is there's no free will. But a question that can come out of this, can I even trust this evolved intellect to even make a conclusion about the big questions? How can I trust this piece of flesh between my ears, which is all my mind could possibly be? How could I even trust that? Well, we're going to get a little bit more positive here. Scientists in the 20th century began to really make some interesting observations. Now, there had been some even before that, but this scripture was a very inspirational scripture to some real dumb people like Isaac Newton and Galileo and Copernicus and Kepler. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, Boyle, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. What about the understand part? If we're made in the image of God by a rational God, Newton, all those guys said, his creation has been made for our rational mind to go using that rational gift he's given us to find him. So, belief in God was one of the great stimuli of modern science, the preliminaries to modern science. In the pre-1800s, this was what was driving science, was the rational belief in God would lead to discovering him. So, what does a Canadian park guide, comedian actor Ben Stein, atheist Richard Dawkins, comedian podcast giant Joe Rogan, and me have in common? There's someone all of us know. It's my boss, who I work for at Discovery Institute, Stephen Meyer. We'll talk a little bit more about how those other guys connect with him. So, there are three main arguments he makes in this most recent book he put out in 2023. I think it was 22. These are from the 20th century science. The universe had a beginning. It was fine-tuned from the beginning, incredibly fine-tuned from the beginning. And there was evidence for infusion of information in more than one phase of the history of life. Those are all 20th century discoveries that he highlights in his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. So the material universe had a beginning. We're going to focus on a lot of this right now. There are the others I'm not going to spend as much time on, but I definitely want to hit this a little deeper just because we don't have time for one of them, really. So this is Pasadena, California, Mount Wilson. That's the observatory on Mount Wilson. And in that observatory, a scientist who had a telescope named after him, Edwin Hubble, was viewing the cosmos. At the same time, there was a scientist in Europe doing the same thing from a different angle. Didn't know much about each other. But this European scientist, there was actually two of them in this picture, one of which you might know, the guy with the bad haircut. Anyone guess that name? Albert Einstein. Einstein was a devout materialist at this stage of his career and had done all of his mathematical equations under the assumption there could not have been a beginning to the universe. He had to believe in an eternal universe. Well, Georges Lemaitre from Belgium was studying these very same things and began to figure out something. So he has a conversation with Einstein, and Einstein rejects it. And then Einstein gets a call from Hubble. And he concludes, after Hubble's interaction with him, that Lemaitre was right all along. The universe was not static. It had a beginning. So these scientists began exploring the universe, and the universe talked back. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There it was. And what about the implications? Arthur Eddington. Philosophically, understand this, philosophically, not scientifically, philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order is repugnant. I should like to find a genuine loophole. What's the implication? He doesn't like what science is saying, and he really, really, really wants to find a way around it. I simply do not believe the present order of things started off with a bang. The expanding universe is preposterous. It leaves me cold, as Stephen Meyer would mock him with his British accent. So, what is Robert Deck at Princeton? Infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of understanding the origin of matter at any finite time. That's why were these guys so scared of this? Because a universe with a beginning means something. We knew this, right? We didn't have to go to science to figure this out. But really, what about it? Whoops. Sorry about that. Got ahead of myself. So, this is an argument that began in the Middle Ages. Actually, probably in the Middle East. It's called the Kalam or cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe must have a cause separate from itself. There's a book written in modern times by a man named William Lane Craig, and William Lane Craig taught for 7 years at the Catholic University of Leuven. He taught philosophy. He's an American, but he studied philosophy in Germany, and then one of his first jobs after he finished his PhD was in Leuven teaching. But he has written a book on this, really, really good book. And he's also written a book, interesting enough, about the resurrection of Christ. It's really worth reading as well. So, a faith and a knowledge resting on the hope of eternal life, which God, who does not lie, promised before the beginning of time. So, something outside of matter and energy and space and time had to be real. Stephen Hawking wrote his PhD's dissertation from Cambridge on the idea of the singularity, which is basically a statement that said everything was reduced to nothing. If you go back in time, it gets all the way reduced to nothing. Then he spent the rest of his career trying to undo that work. The best data we have, this is Arnold Penzias, who actually discovered background noise that verified the same kind of noise that would have been present at a beginning event. It's a long story. I can't give you all the details, but the point is, he said the best data we have concerning the Big Bang, I'll talk about that, are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. The Big Bang is an effect. Let's be clear. It's very commonly confused in Christianity that the Big Bang is our enemy. Oh, God, that's how everything was created. No, it's not how everything was created. It's a result of a creation happening. It's an effect, it's not a cause. It's our friend, okay? These guys hated the idea of a Big Bang. In fact, the name the Big Bang was a pejorative term, trying to minimize it. Because the reality of a Big Bang theory is that the universe had not been eternal. And there was a cause outside of it that created it. Didn't name the cause, but the idea that there was a cause. So this is interesting. This is Jastrow, who actually for years ran that Mount Whistling Observatory. This is an exceedingly strange development, unexpected by all but the theologians. Go on to read more of this. They have always accepted the word of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It is unexpected because science has such extraordinary success in tracing the chain of cause and effect backward in time. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. So, in addition to the beginning, in Stephen Meyer's book, he talks about the fine-tuning. We're going to go over this very quickly now. Basically, it talks about the idea that in the earliest stages, the fine-tuning of things like gravity, the forces that hold atoms together, electromagnetic spectrum, had to be incredibly, exquisitely fine-tuned to a very low, high improbability if it was by chance. The probability of all these constants, exactly what they needed to be, are 1 with 0. You have to use an infinite number of zeros to describe the number of zeros that were in the probability. The multiverse hypothesis that you may hear sometimes these days, in fact, Spider-Man and the multiverse kind of stuff, it's this belief that the only way to get around the mathematical improbability is to postulate there are multiple universes of infinite numbers that eventually one of them had to have all the right constants. It's unfalsifiable. You can't disprove it. But there is not one shred of evidence for it. And ironically, if you think of all these independent universes, unless they had a universe-generating mechanism, which itself would require fine-tuning, the argument falls to the ground anyway. So the present arrangement of matter indicates a very special choice of initial conditions. A common sense interpretation, Fred Hoyle was the one who called the Big Bang because he hated the idea. He later became a believer. He was a Cambridge professor. But this is him when he finally looks at all the data. He says, the common sense interpretation suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology. There are those monkeys coming into the origins question, right? So there's also a third thing in the book, evidence of intelligent design in life, infusions of digital information. When I was wrestling with these 2 young men, I went looking on the internet for some resources. I'm still happily in my practice, but remember, I'm having this question about what God wants for me the rest of my life. I found a book called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, and that just caught my attention big time because of a physician and DNA. I had always said, yeah, there's so much design in what I'm studying in med school. There had to be a God, but I never had quantified it. Well, it gets quantified in his first book, and he brings it back up in his last book I've just been talking about. But the numerical probabilities I'll get to in just a second. But basically, Darwin's theory, we'll talk just briefly about him. I wish we could talk a lot about him, but I still don't have time. Basically was a very rigid, materialistic version of the onset of life. Now, there's things about evolution that we all agree on. Change over time, right? You see a Swede and an Aborigine, something over time changed between their two pathways, okay? That's not hard to follow. You look at dog breeds, you look at, mice, rats, maybe, but macroevolution, that's the major body plans, the different major between birds, reptiles. The science is awful for that. It's just a fossil record. It'd be like looking at a Corvette and a pickup truck and said they evolved from each other. I mean, well, they kind of look like each other and there's some traits in common, but there's no transitions. So universal common descent, the tree of life, did we all come from the same things? Did the plants in my yard and my puppy and me all come from the same first cell? So natural selection acting on random mutations. There's no need for a designer, according to Richard Dawkins. Nature was its own breeder. It selected things out. It's a good theory. It really is, without any other thought but just the possibility of it. But the evidence for it is awful. So in Steve Meyer's book, in the first book, he's talking about the origin of life, which is not a Darwinian question, by the way. Darwin starts with life and then has it evolve. But Darwin just barely waves his hand at the idea of how the first life ever came around. And origin of life's research, by the way, there is not any scientist who claims we really know the origin of life. They go from chemistry to living cell. There's a guy named Jim Tour. If you want to Google Jim Tour at Rice University, he is a high-level synthetic chemist. I mean, he is uber brilliant. And he has written and talked about the origin of life, and he just calls it for what it is. It's ignorance. I mean, we know nothing. In 70 years since the Miller-Urey experiment, we know nothing. But that's just one argument, the idea of the origin of life. But for one little, simple, single-celled bacteria to make one functional protein, which means the amino acids had to be perfectly lined up in an order, 1 in 10 to the 77th. And that math that he uses, I love math, by the way, is absolutely elegant. It is impeccable math, and it gives the enemy everything. Oh yeah, you can start with the amino acids already fully created. You can start with the sugar phosphates already fully created. It's just the sequence that they're put in that doesn't work, because you have to have a design. Random processes does not. 1 in 10 to the 77th is basically beyond the probabilistic resources of a 13 billion-year-old Earth. You don't need an age of the Earth. The long argument for the Darwinists is, given enough time, anything can happen. Nope. Not with 13.7 billion years. That's not even enough time, with several more zeros beyond it. Darwin's doubt gets into the idea that in his next book, which there's a Canadian connection big time here, the idea of new body plans, same information problem. So if you think about the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum, have any of you seen the Rosetta Stone before? It's got inscriptions of hieroglyphics, and I believe Latin, and maybe some other dialects. And it's how they broke the code of the Egyptian hieroglyphics. They see these languages there. It was discovered in a desert, just an isolated stone by itself. So did it happen by wind and erosion? Or was a mind behind it? Now, you can argue how the mind carved it. You can argue how a mind sequenced DNA. But DNA is much more complex than the Rosetta Stone, and nobody argues that the Rosetta Stone came from a mind. Anytime there is an infusion of information, repeated scientific experience over and over again, it always comes from a mind. And that's the third conclusion of his book. This is Mount Stevens, about 600 miles west of here, just near, very near Lake Louise. And we're standing there. That's Dr. Meyer. Where is he? He's on the second from the end on the right. That's one son with his arm around him and another one son squatting for him and some weird dude with some weird looking hat next to him there. That was in the summer of 2017 when I was still a semi-employed physician, but not anything but just throwing a little bit of money at the Discovery Institute because of Stephen Meyer. But at this date, at this time, I had arranged for him to come speak at Oklahoma Christian. And he was starting to notice me. You really are into what we're doing. I said, yes. Well, here on this mountain, the guide that took us up that day, when we started that morning, he introduced himself and said, I'm Paul, and I forget his last name, and I'm an atheist paleontologist, and I'm here to take you up to this Burgess Shell. In Darwin's book, The Origin of the Species, he talks about the Cambrian fossil layer, where an explosion of multiple life forms show up in one fossil layer in an instant of geological time. I think if you put the geological time scale, whatever you call it, a young Earth or an old Earth, if it's a 24-hour day, the Cambrian period was 3 minutes of a 24-hour day. And over half of the phylum we know today show up all at the same time. That is not a Darwinian thing, and he knew it when he wrote his book. But his expectations and prophecy was, given enough time and enough research, we will find these intermediary fossil layers digging deeper that show the origin and gradual transformation of life. And so Steve writes the book, Darwin's Doubt, and says, well, that was 150 years ago. What's happened since then in Darwin's Doubt? It's still the same doubt. So there we were looking at all that, and Paul, the two sons, I was walking next to them, and they had a running bet. How long is it going to be before Dad engages this guy? And we had a really neat conversation with him, actually. And at one point, I'm talking with him, and I say, Paul, he grew up in a Baptist church in Canada. He lost his faith because of this. And he was no longer a believer because of the Darwin. And I said, Paul, you're talking about, the strict young earth upbringing. I said, yeah. I said, no, I'm not here to take a position on the age of the earth, but there are a lot of believers that have seen Genesis and realize that there's no timetable rigidly written into that. Now, there is an argument for a young earth from Genesis, but there's also arguments for others. What if that was not a problem? Would you still have a problem? He goes, well, I'd be open. And Steve walks up and he says, look, I'd love to see your dissertation. Please send it to me, and I'll send you a free copy of my book. He asked, when he learned the group from Discovery Institute was going on this hike, he wanted that hike. And we treated him without any scripting. Everyone treated him with respect and decency. And they have still, I think, a conversation going on. He's still not reverted yet, but nonetheless, that's the backstory of Canada. So, the idea that God created the universe is a more respectable hypothesis today than at any time in the last 100 years. So, in summary, the universe had a beginning. It was fine-tuned from the beginning, and the information needed to create life and the new forms of life speak to needing a designer. Random, unguided, undirected processes, the math doesn't work. And you're from a math geek. So, we had a conference in Dallas in 2017, and a videographer there filming the conference started having tears go down her eyes when Steve was talking about his book. And her boss asked her after the evening was over, I saw tears down your eyes. And she says, I started out as a biology major in college, and I was hearing things about origins that couldn't reconcile from my faith, and I had to quit that and start studying something else. And tonight is the first time I've seen I don't have to check my brain to be a believer. We got a letter in Seattle from a man named Robert. I'm a retired engineer of sorts that majored in math and physics at a university in Texas. My career was focused on semiconductors and computers, and quite a lot of my leisure reading focused on topics concerning physics, math, and philosophy. I'm writing this note to express my gratitude for your book, Return of the God Hypothesis. I became an agnostic in my teens and remained one for 7 decades until I was recently given a copy of your book. It is the most interesting and comprehensive examination of one of life's most important questions, and it has irrevocably altered my point of view of God, the universe, and everything within it. By the end of the chapters discussing the extreme fine-tuning of the universe, not surprising one of my favorites, I was completely persuaded. I was not as familiar with the topics examined in the succeeding chapters, but I enjoyed learning about them. They are also clearly presented and persuasive. I appreciate the fact that you have presented opposing points of view and their supporting arguments and why you subscribe to the ones you have that I now share. Thank you for your life-changing book. It is the most important book for me that I have ever read. That was from North Carolina, where my sister lives. I told the people in Seattle, he's mine. I call him, we start visiting. I said, I have a sister that lives in Durham. He lives in Wilmington. I said, I'd love to meet you. He goes, I would love to meet you. So I fly and spend time with my sister, and I drive out to meet him. And he still really, even to this day, has been inching toward Christianity. I would say inching. He sends me articles that support it even, and reaches out to me. And I happen to know a Belgian teammate that lives in North Carolina. And Mark and Jill have met Robert. And that's a story we need to keep praying about, because he texted me just the other day, Mark, some new article he wanted me to look at and such. Anyway, that's my story today. Let's see here. If you want to take a picture of that, you can. Those are websites. I have some books down here and some DVDs that go into so much more depth than what I just did on various topics. In my hands here, I'm going to lay these out here, but those are all on that table. Take it if you want it. The Farm at the Center of the Universe is a fictional story about a young boy who's been confronted by his atheist cousin about these very questions. He goes to Grandpa's farm, and Grandpa teaches him the evidence for God from nature. Any of y'all know William Steig? He's passed away, but he wrote a lot of little tiny books like this. And this one's called Yellow and Pink, and it's 2 puppets having dialogue back and forth with each other about how they existed. God's not mentioned once in this book, but it's a great book for little kids just to get their little critical brains thinking about how did we get here. And then this one is a graphic form, which is a bunch of 2 cartoon characters arguing for the existence of God using various mathematical things. These are all aimed at young people, okay? We have stuff, the scientists that work for us have degrees from, Steve Myers from Cambridge, we have MIT, Harvard, Princeton, Caltech, Cal Berkeley, University of Chicago, international universities, other Ivy League campuses. We come to the gunfight with more than a knife, I promise you. And we argue, again, out of science. And you know you're over the target when the flak is at the heaviest. One of our scientists just sent a letter to the Smithsonian with a brand new article that came out 6 weeks ago from Nature, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals. You dig into the article, it's not in the headline of the article, but you dig into the article and it becomes absolutely clear that the ape-human genome similarity is a myth. And there's significant difference in the genome when you do it totally objectively, which this article did. And they hid the data, but one of our guys dove into it, and he has now sent the Smithsonian a formal letter saying, you have signs in your museum that are representing inaccurate science. You need to change that. We're not afraid to push a little bit. So, questions? Yes?
What's your opinion on the BioLogos organization?
Great question. I'll answer it the way Steve Meyer did when he spoke at Oklahoma Christian. BioLogos. That's the organization that was formed by Francis Collins. He no longer leads it, but he's very connected with it. He is no longer in his political position at the director of the NIH. When Steve Meyer, what is my opinion of BioLogos? It's a theistic organization, theistic evolution, evolutionary creation. The implications of their position, right or wrong, not everyone is, just like not everyone in my organization is exactly the same. So in fairness to them, let's start off. This is Stephen Meyer's answer when the same question was asked to him by students at Oklahoma Christian. He says, first of all, the ones that I know, and I'm assuming most of the ones beside the ones I know, believe in a resurrected Jesus and a virgin birth. And so we have something incredibly important in common in a world today when those things are not held to be true. So let's start with that. Number two, in my prior two books, this was before Return of the God Hypothesis was actually published when he was at Oklahoma Christian. It was being created but was not ready for publication yet. He spoke on it, but nonetheless, that was not ready yet. But he said to them, in my first two books, they have been the most critical, more so than the atheistic evolutionaries. In their defense, and he would say the same thing, just like when John Clayton first came into my world, some of the things he did for me was be critical of books and articles arguing for the existence of God that weren't good science. And so they're not liking our science. But if you go to the Language of God, which I've read, it's by Francis Collins, and it was about the time he was forming BioLogos. It's called the Language of God, and the implication, because he was the head of the Human Genome Project, that DNA was the language of God. No, that's not what's in the book. In the book, he's very critical of some of our scientists, and his arguments are just dead wrong. Now, he came to faith because of fine-tuning that we talked about here. So there's some neat... Francis Collins left atheism to become a believer because of the fine-tuning argument. So that's a good thing. But they're giving up theological ground that they don't have to. And that's what frustrates us. But Steve was saying they're the most critical of my books. And we're going to answer them. And we did. We put out a very thick volume called Theistic Evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique. And it's broken in this brochure here. The book is one of the ones in there. This brochure has a lot of our resources in it, okay? But so his answer to him, he goes to this young student that asked the question, he goes, this is a great question. So he talks about what he has in common and the mutual respect on some arguments. But he said they've been most critical and they're giving up theological ground, and we're about to answer it with the book. But I will tell you in advance of that book that I have asked them this question repeatedly and have yet to get a firm answer, which is, can God direct an undirected process? Remember Dawkins' statement, Darwin, undirected. They're Darwinists. They believe God created us through the Darwinian mechanism. But implied in that is that there was no first Adam. So Paul and Jesus have to rework their theology. You're giving up theological ground when you go there with them because they're basing it on what is bad science. In Francis Collins' Language of God, one of the biggest critiques of the intelligent design movement was that the human genome had been discovered to not be entirely coding. In other words, all the DNA code that's in the human genome wasn't coding proteins, and therefore it was junk, only by assumption, not by any science. The science to look into that was that functional in a different way? If it didn't code, did it have any other function? That had not been done yet. And two of our scientists came out, Bill Dembski and Jonathan Wells, both said, we haven't done the science either, but as having a worldview that the universe and life was intelligently created, we're going to make a stand right now and say, when you research it, you're going to find purpose. Mainstream science has thrown away junk DNA. It's not in the language anymore because it's full of purpose. Regulatory purposes, even if it doesn't code. So the answer is, when no one knew, our guys said, we think it's going to show purpose, and they were proved correct, which is one of the critiques they have of us, is it doesn't make predictions. Intelligent design doesn't make predictions. And our two scientists came out and said, we predict that it will have purpose. And those guys, Dawkins has eaten his words. And we're running close on time, aren't we? But I got 5 minutes left. But any other questions? Okay, well, it's you know, this clock, I've been incorrectly looking at the wrong clock. So any other questions? You can talk to me personally. Feel free to get these materials. Don't take these yet. I want you guys, if you're interested in it, to email me back, and I can get you some of these shipped to you for only the shipping charge. If you want to give them to 10 high school students or 10 college students or 10 middle school students, I can get these shipped to you. I just want you guys to be able to take pictures of these. This you can just grab. This book is by someone outside of our organization, but he walks you through good question and answers on some of these apologetic questions and cultural questions as well. His name is Greg Kokel. This is called Street Smarts. Using questions to answer Christianity's toughest challenges. And Privileged Planet, newest edition, just came out a year ago. It was written 20 years ago during an eclipse year, and the second edition was made after the last eclipse that we just had in North America last year. Phenomenal book. The universe, this Earth, is a privileged planet. It's not the insignificant blue dot that Carl Sagan labeled it as. The Earth is incredibly fine-tuned. No math doesn't work. It had to be designed, and not only is it fine-tuned for life, it's fine-tuned for discovery. You can do some of the best astronomy from the Earth and anywhere in the solar system. So God, who created us, wanted to put us in a place where we could look out and find him and let his universe talk back to us. So, yeah. I would love private conversations. I'm burdened by my own daughter's loss of faith. And so I know it's a tough call for a lot of us. Nephew, daughter, others. I'd love to be a resource for you. We can stand on really, really solid science. I'm